everyone. I wish to welcome you at this EUREX seminar, which is co-organized by Polish section of Regional Studies Association. I have a pleasure to be a chairman of the association, and I will chair today's session. And today we have a pleasure to host our guest, Dr. Giulio Mattioli, who, as you see, specializes in transport mobility. So I think that we will have very interesting presentation on this topic. And just to set the scene, may I ask you a question? Is there anybody in this room who didn't travel by air in last 5 years? Please do not hesitate, share with us. Raise your hand if anybody didn't travel by air. One? Okay, so the sun is set, so now the floor is yours. And just to inform you that you have 45 minutes. After that, we'll have a discussion, and then and questions to you. And after that, we will have an opportunity to give answers. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Really sorry about the late entrance. And thank you for having me, and thank you to Michel for organizing this visit. It was a pleasure to be here at your institute this week. I'm not sure if people usually stay or sit. I will try and stay, but I might sit at some point. So I will start from what is the background to most of my research, really, which is transport and climate change. So transport accounts for quite a lot of climate change emissions. And the share of climate emissions transport is responsible for is expected to increase over time. So going from about 30% of GHG in the EU right now to 44% towards the end of the decade. And the reason for that is that we are managing to decrease emissions in other sectors, but not in transport. So the result is that the climate problem will increasingly be a transport problem going forward. And so it's considered a hard-to-abate sector, and even countries that have reduced their emissions by a lot, typically they have not reduced emissions in the transport sector, or they even have increased them. And the basic reason why this happens, in a nutshell, is that there have been technological improvements which have made transport modes more energy efficient, or less carbon intensive. But these have typically been offset by an increase in travel activity. So if you travel more and emit slightly fewer emissions per kilometer, at the end of the day, you may emit more. And this is pretty much what is going on here. And this typically leads researchers in this space, so in sustainable transport research, to conclude that we need travel demand, so-called travel demand management measures, so measures that act on demand, things like pricing or other measures that would reduce or curb travel activity, so keep it in check, make sure it doesn't increase as much. But these have proven time and time again pretty difficult to introduce. So this is sort of background. One thing you may not know is that when we're talking about transport and climate emissions, about 90% of them are due to just two modes, cars and planes. But in two very different ways. So this graph is for Germany, and it's pretty dated, but it wouldn't be very different for other comparable countries. The two modes contribute in two very different ways. So there's the pie chart on the left showed the number of trips, and you can barely see no planes there. Planes is yellow. So very few trips are by plane, but they are over very long distances, and they are very carbon intensive. So if you look at the climate impact, about half of it is due to aircraft, and the other half is due to cars, but it's due. So basically, climate impact of transport is due to many shorter trips by car and to few long trips by plane. So combination of two very different things. So in this presentation, I will briefly talk about both modes. I will start about cars and then quickly talk about planes, which is the main object of my presentation. And I will give you a number of findings from a project I have been leading for a number of years, and which are relevant in the context of what of this presentation. So let me first tell you about car dependence. This is a term, I don't know if you've come across it in your work, but it's pretty common in transport studies. And it's basically used to, it originates from urban planning. It was used to identify areas where you can, it's very hard. Sorry, I didn't realize I had to speak Phil. Uh, so it was basically used initially to identify areas or type of cities where basically you really need a car to do anything, like Australian suburbs or American suburbs and so on. But then over time, this concept has broadened to include a larger number of interdisciplinary approaches, like coming from psychology or sociology, to say, pointing out that there are different ways of thinking about this thing. And in my mind, I think there are like three not entirely overlapping perspectives on car dependence. One is like, we are trying to reduce car use or make sure it doesn't grow. But when we try to do that with policy, typically there is a bit of inertia or backlash or resistance to that. And this is what car dependence is. So this is like very theoretically non-sophisticated or pragmatic. The second approach is more like about, it's the idea that in some circumstances or in some contexts, you may actually need cars in order to be socially included or to participate in society or to satisfy your needs and so on. And then the third way of thinking about it is that there is like some positive feedback loops, some sort of systematic process, a self-reinforcing process going on that explains why levels of car use tend to increase or are so difficult to reduce. In that context, in my early research, I put forward this typology of understandings of car dependence in transport studies, which I'm not very happy with these days, but it's had a bit of an impact on the research in this area. So basically, I was saying, okay, there are basically three levels, three understandings. One is more micro and thinks about the car dependence of individuals. So certain people are really, really keen on using cars, and how can we explain this, for example, with psychology and so on. And then there's more macro level, which is like, no, there are some places where, you can't choose whether you use a car or not. You have to if you live there. And this is more like coming from urban planning, and it leads to other research interests and other solutions, such as planning cities in a different way. And then there's more of a meso understanding, which is the least developed, which is like, no, in order, there are certain activities or practices that in order to do them, you really need a car, regardless of almost of what you think as an individual or where you live. Say, if you're going to IKEA, it's not going to make a very big difference what you think about cars or where you live. You will at least consider using a car, right? So this was the basic idea. So to go back a little, why does car dependence make climate policy more difficult? And so if we think about it in the second understanding that I listed before, which is the one more about needs. So there are some contexts or circumstances where you may really need in order to be able to access services and opportunities which you need for your social inclusion and so on. And if that happens, these sort of pressures people who are on low incomes to own and use cars, despite the fact that owning and using cars is like pretty expensive, tends to put the pressure on the household budget. And so you will have people who struggle with the resulting expenditure. Either they constrain how much they travel, or they have to cut other parts of the budget, and they are certainly vulnerable to further increases in the price of fuel. Now, the problem is like the main way in which the EU is considering to finally reducing emissions in the transport sector is by pricing it. So they have decided to include road transport into the so-called emission trading system, which is a complicated thing, sort of equivalent to carbon pricing, but not really. But at the end of the day, it is expected from 2027, but they just postponed it to 28. it is expected. We don't really know how much it will increase fuel prices, but there have been estimates that say it will increase fuel prices at the pump by the same amount as what happened during the Ukraine crisis, right? So you can see that this is a bit of a policy head scratch, because obviously the EU is thinking, yeah, okay, what if we get a huge political backlash? What if we get another Giulio Mattioli movement, but EU-wide? Which is why now they have established this thing called the Social Climate Fund, which is basically we try preemptively to identify people who are vulnerable to these fuel price increases, who are car dependent and low incomes, for example, and we try to compensate them beforehand to take action so that they are a bit shielded from these impacts. So this is an illustration of how this problem of dependence sort of creates an issue with climate policy. This is just to say that I will now stop talking about cars and bring the discussion on to planes. So what about air travel? Air travel, it is in some ways similar to issues we have with cars and road transport, in some ways very different. So it is similar in that uh, we have the same dynamic of travel activity growing and more than offsetting any technological improvement, which results in increasing emissions, but a lot more pronounced because like we do have EVs for a car sector. It takes a while to sub replace the fleet and so on, but there is some lower carbon technological solutions. In aviation, it's a lot more difficult in a few decades ahead. And car use, at least in Western Europe, is not growing as much anymore. It sort of saturates. That wouldn't be the case in Poland, for example, or in other parts of Eastern Europe. But emissions are not growing as much in certain countries, whereas air travel emissions and air travel activity has been growing a lot, pretty much everywhere. On the other hand, like we have here, so this this same dynamic leads to the same conclusion. Hey, so that we need air travel, travel demand management measures in this sector as well, like in the car sector. And here, things that have been suggested include, for example, pricing. I'm not sure if you're aware, but aviation is currently exempt from many taxes. So we pay, if I drive tomorrow back to Dortmund, I will pay taxes, quite a large amount of taxes on fuel I put in my tank. But if I fly tomorrow to Dortmund, I will basically not pay any taxes, so very little, which is part of the reason why it's so cheap. So one of the main suggestions has been to finally introduce taxes to a comparable level. It's often also exempted from VAT. There's been suggestion of introducing some more sophisticated pricing mechanisms, such as this frequent flyer levy, which is often mentioned in the UK, which would accept the first flight a person takes in a year, and then charge an increasing levy to every subsequent flight. So you will not pay taxes on your first flight, but you will pay a certain amount of taxes on your second in a year, then like a lot more in on the second, and so on and so on. And this is to discourage people who fly a lot. And that there's been suggestion to simply, instead of intervening on demand, more like constraining supplies, so making sure we do not expand airports. Now, one difference between car use and air travel is that air travel is a lot more unequal. So most people in European countries will drive. Most people in European countries would not, very much unlike people in this room, most people in European countries would not fly in a given year. So they fly either less than once a year or never. And most of the emissions and most of the flights actually are caused by a small number of people who tend to fly frequently, which may or may not include some of the people in this room, like based on the initial survey that I conducted. Also, another difference is, well, transport is always a bit of a mixture of luxury and necessity. Like even car use, we can use it to go to work, we can use it to go to the hospital, we can use it to go on holiday. on for air travel, the balance is a bit more skewed. That like a whole lot of air travel is due actually to holidays and tourism. Uh, but that doesn't mean that there may not be flights that due to things we can think of as necessities, such as visiting friends and family. It's a growing segment of air travel. Uh, so the idea behind this presentation and behind discussions we've been having with Michel and Philip over this week is like, can we think of sort of an air travel equivalent of car dependence? Can we think about flight dependence? What would that be? So, as I said, we have two very different modes here. In one case, it's more like the issue is more entrenched and hard to unlock. Like most of the growth in car travel has happened already, at least over here in Europe, and it's more a question of how do we reduce it. Whereas with air travel, as we said, most people don't fly, but it's growing very rapidly. And, could it be that we are sort of now living the processes that might lock it in and make it harder to address later on? And yeah, so like, if you know the transport literature a bit, there's a lot of these sort of circles and self-reinforcing spirals showing, there are many things that happen in the transport sector that tend to result in a self-reinforcing cycle of increasing car use, such as people will start using cars and that will create congestion. And then we will say, okay, let's make the road bigger. And by making the road bigger, we will encourage more people to use cars and so on and so forth. So like the idea behind these discussions we're having is like, are there similar processes that we can identify in the air travel sector? So thinking about it, I was just trying to put down some interesting guiding question for a research agenda in this space. So I think interesting questions in this space would be, what explains inertia and resistance to attempts to reduce air travel at the three levels of individuals, practices, and social structures or locations. But also, is air traveling becoming essential for the satisfaction of certain needs for at least certain people, at least in certain circumstances? And which sort of self-reinforcing path-dependent process can we identify, maybe in the incipient nascent stage, that might lead to something called as flight dependence? In this context, I will present you some empirical findings from this project I have been I led. It's not done. At TU Dortmund University in Germany. The project was like on long distance travel, but I ended up focusing mostly air travel. And in this project, I was able to provide some suggestive evidence of some emerging flight dependence mechanism through the stretching of social networks and activity spaces, through induced demand effect of airport infrastructure, and through socialization to holiday abroad. So like the idea that if you experience flying and going on holidays abroad early in life, that might make you more uh, likely to do so as an adult. And also we were able to provide evidence of inequality in air travel and how it's changed over time and what that implies for example, taxation policy in this area. So my presentation is an overview mainly of findings. So I will not tell you much about the methods, but mainly most of what I'm presenting is based on secondary quantitative data analysis of existing data sets. The main one I use is something called the UK House of Longitudinal Study, which is a very large generalist survey that they have in the UK, where they have some very interesting data. You can find in the same data set some interesting questions on, first of all, the number of private flights in the last 12 months by world region, which sort of allows you to estimate the emissions. migration generation, so whether people were born abroad or whether parents and grandparents were born abroad. Uh, Interesting questions about the spatial dispersion of social networks. Does your family live abroad? Does your best friend live abroad? And also spatial identifiers at the neighborhood level, which allow me, for example, to know how far they live from the airport. So this was the main data set I was using just because it's so rich. And then we had a sort of unique TU Dortmund student survey, which is like, it's not representative, but for a number of years, we asked our students to uh, tell us about their travel behavior over the life course, not just their travel behavior, but also their parents and their grandparents. So we could link these levels, which is interesting for things like socialization. And in this case, it included questions on how they travel abroad, which is not the same as air travel, but there's an overlap. And then I also use National Travel Service in both England and Germany, but here there was less unusual information there. And mostly looked into air travel frequency and questions about inequality. So coming to the first piece of findings, this is about the impact of migration background and social networks dispersion on air travel. So through regression models based on cross-section data, controlling for a whole range of intervening factors, we were able to find net effects for being a recent migrant. So if you live in the UK since less than 5 years, there's an increase in the number of flights by 41% that you take in a year. And there's an increase in 1.5 tons in kilograms of CO2 for personal flights. This does not include the business. If on the top of that, if you identify as of Asian or Asian British ethnicity, that adds another 500 on the top. If you have close family abroad, it adds another 600 on the top. And if you have best friends abroad, adds another 600. So these are not trivial amounts because I think the average emissions of a European or Western European would be, or per person with the UK, for all purposes in a year might be something like 2 tons. Correct me if I'm wrong. Oh. Altogether. Holy jeez. Yeah. More like a 10. Okay. Right. Yeah, so I remember around that, but certainly these are like large for travel, so they would probably like deplete your travel carbon budget in a year without you ever using a car. We then did some further analysis looking at people in a cohabiting relationship because we were interested in further social network effects. So, like, what if I don't have migration background, but my partner does, like, etc. And we did find that kind of effect, which sort of suggests that we're just scratching the surface of these social network effects because we were only able to know if they're close family, meaning parents or children, were living abroad and not, for example, uncles or cousins or whatever. So, but it seems that even your partner having relatives abroad has an impact, which makes intuitive sense, but sort of tells us something about the magnitude of these social network effects. And then we did a study based on the longitudinal data, so see how emissions change for the same people between 2012 and 2019. And we found that people who acquired family abroad between the two waves, but also people who maintain them, tend to increase their flights more than other people over time. So there's quite a bit of evidence here pointing in that direction that this effect exists. So coming to the second set of 4D, it's concerns what it's called in transport studies induced demand. So what do we mean by that? We mean something very simple, which is sometimes explained through this motto, build them and they will come. So basically, if you build infrastructure, people will start using it. Right? So if you build, for example, super cycle highways in London, the number of people who cycle will increase. But also if, like in Berlin, you open a new urban motorway, as they just did like a couple of months ago, people will start using it. And as they did, it was totally crippled by congestion within the first 2 days. right? And the ironic thing is like they made this new urban motorway because they were trying to get rid of congestion, but like by building transport infrastructure, sort of encourage people to use it. So and this has been identified for decades as a sort of self-reinforcing dynamic whereby we expand transport infrastructure as we try to reduce congestion, but that encourages more travel demand, which brings back congestion to a higher level of travel activity, and so on and so forth. So, is there something similar for air travel and airports? So, like with that data set, I was able to uh, sort of match the survey data with spatial accessibility data. So I knew how much time it would take them to get to the nearest airport, how many airports they could access within 1 hour travel time, and so on. And I did find some association with that, which is consistent with the idea that if you have, if infrastructure improves near you, you will tend to use it more. Keep in mind that another explanation is self-selection. So, like, for example, people who have family abroad might choose to live near to an airport. But I was controlling for these things in this case, or for at least some. So, uh, it's not conclusive evidence of this effect, but it is consistent with the idea that there might be some reduced demand effect. Note that the magnitude of the effects, I mean, these effects were significant statistically speaking, but the magnitude is much lower than the others. So just 37 kilos or 125 kilos uh, for having one more airport within 60 minutes. So it doesn't seem to be such a big driver in terms of magnitude. Uh, and then we did the longitudinal analysis, which sort of give mixed findings. So we found that people who already had better access to airports in 2012 increased their flights more, but people who improved their access to airports between the two waves did not fly, which could be due to the fact that only few people within the sample actually moved between the two waves, a small sample size, and so on. But yeah, the evidence is a bit less robust here. But there are not many studies that have looked into this question. But there's I know of a study in Switzerland, one in the U.S. that have done so, and they have found similar results. So all studies I know that have looked at this association and found um, significant association. And yeah, this is about the third interesting lock-in mechanism, which is socialization. Here, different data set. So we had a sample of students, their parents, their grandparents, and we asked things about travel over the life course. So in this sample, we had people who were born like pre-1930s to people born in the 1990s. So a big span of generations. And we asked them, for example, about the age at first holiday abroad. So the different lines are people who had their first holiday abroad by age 6, by age 11, by age 18. And you see like a massive increase here, right? Even so basically pretty much no one had been abroad by age 6 among people born in the 30s, but pretty most people born in the 90s have. Um, this is, of course, like it's a particular sample. These are people who go to university, so we might expect them to fly more. But like the differences between generations are still striking. It has become a lot more commonplace to go abroad on holiday as a child, and this is first holiday outside of Europe. And here we see like a later increase, but it's a curve that it's starting to spike up as well. And these are much more likely to be trips that are made by plane. And so there was no information, unfortunately, in this data set about the mode of these trips, except, they asked them about what was the mode for the first holiday abroad. And we see that an increasing share of these trips abroad, of these first trips abroad, were made by plane. Keep in mind, this is Germany in the center of Europe. So like most trips abroad will be by car, typically. Might be very different for places like the UK where they tend to fly a lot more. And this is like trends in the number of holiday trips abroad to date for people in different generations. And we see that, obviously, uh, we see that people in the 90s who would have been in their 20s, so these are students in their 20s, they already have undertaken as many trips abroad as their grandparents have done in their whole life, right? Just by age 20. Um, Obviously, their parents will have more because they have lived longer, so they have more years to do them. So if we normalize by year of birth, we see like a massive increase here as well. So people have been increasingly exposed and have experienced trips abroad during their life. But so far, like it was just descriptive results. We did go beyond this and looked into use multivariate methods and regression to look at intergenerational effects, so associations between what the parents did and what the children did, and also socialization effects, so associations between what you did as a child and what you did later as an adult. So here I'm cheating a little because I'm presenting this as if it were structural equation modeling, which it wasn't. I just did regression, but I'm sort of presenting the results, so summarizing the results of different regression models in a chart. So what does this chart say? So on the left we have parents' characteristics, on the right we have children characteristics. And this says, for example, that if your parents were highly educated, you were more likely to have a first holiday abroad at a younger age, and you are more likely to have had more holidays abroad with your parents, both of which are associated with you having more holidays abroad without your parents later on. Right? So this sort of indicates a socialization effect there, particularly among people in families with higher education, as you would expect from people attending university in Germany. And the same applies to the children, second generation migrants, so the children of people born abroad. So if your parents were born abroad, we're also more likely to go abroad earlier and to go abroad more often as a child, which results in you going abroad more often as an adult. So there was evidence of these socialization effects. So this is a graph from another paper, which is about to be resubmitted, which arose from Michel's project. It was led by Philip Schmidt, who is here as well, where they had a very interesting survey in Poland, where we've been trying to explore some similar things. And I'm just showing this graph because it shows like the normalized number of flights, in this case flights, per life year across the different generations in Poland. And it goes like the silent generation from Gen Z, and you see like there's a massive increase here as well. And it's probably much more faster, happened a lot more faster in Poland due to historical reason than it would have happened in places like Germany and the UK. And we do find similar effects in terms of socialization and social network effects, as well as some more. So the paper is online as a preprint, so I'll look at it. Keep going. So up to this point, I told you about these lock-in mechanisms, and now I will change topic slightly and talk about air travel inequality, based again on UK data. So we had a study with Milena Books, which was trying to look into trends in air travel inequality. So there is this narrative that which is pretty common among people like us, but also on the media, from the industry as well, that air travel used to be something for the elites, but it has now become, through low cost and through things like that, something for the masses. Everyone does it, right? And we're trying to look into the data about it. And what we did find that, yes, inequality and participation in air travel is decreasing, but very slightly. So, and it remains very, very, very unequal. And also, if we look at the contribution of different groups, more or less disadvantaged, yes, disadvantaged groups are contributing more in relative terms. So they are more, the probability of flying is increasing. But if we look in absolute terms, who is responsible for the growth, absolute growth in the number of flights over time, then the advantage groups are by far more responsible for that. And there's not much evidence on these trends, but like it is consistent with a study from France. Um, so we estimated the Gini coefficient for the distribution of flights over the population. So, Gini coefficients are supposed to measure inequality, typically for income. In this case, we were measuring inequality in the number of flights. And we used from 2000 to 2017. And we see a bit of a decrease, but it's very little. And you must note, basically, this is not zero. This is 0.6, right? So if I were to show the entire axis, probably the line would look completely flat, right? So it's only if you zoom in that you see this slight decrease over 20 years from a Gini of 0.76 to a Gini of maybe 0.73, which said like, yes, inequality is decreasing. There is a clear trend, but very little. And it will. So what this tells us about the future is that we might expect that to continue decreasing, but it will remain very unequal. So in practice, what does this mean? Like even in the UK, which is one of the countries on Earth where people fly the most, 40 to 60% of people do not fly in a year, and 20% of households are responsible for about 3/4 of flights. So a small sector of the population is responsible for most of the flights. And then we looked, but this was just inequality in general, right? Like who's inequality between those who fly a lot and those who don't fly. This is inequality across income groups. So you can estimate the Gini coefficient also based on another variable. And here also we found very stable. Notice that the axis is cut to the same level as well. So it has decreased a tiny bit, but over 20 years, but very little. And in practice, this means that even in the UK, 60 to 80% of people in the bottom income decile do not fly in a year, whereas the top income quintile is responsible for about 40% of flights. And then I did sort of look into the same thing in Germany, but I will go very quickly with this because I'm sort of running out of time. And here we found that like about 30% of people never fly. They say never, even not less than once a year. They say, I never fly. Another 30 to 40% flies less than once a year. And then people who fly at least 2 times per year are less than 10%. And these people are responsible for about 42% of flights. So I think I will skip with that. And also we looked at the association with income, calculating this concentration ratio, which measures how much the flights are concentrated among certain higher income groups as compared to low income groups. And this concentration ratio was exactly the same in 2008 and 2017. And we did find that in 2017, higher income groups accounted for 36% of respondents, but 54% of flights, whereas 86% of people with very low economic status fly less than once a year or net. So huge inequalities in Germany as well. So what does this imply for policy? We did another study where we tried and modeled what would the impact be of taxing carbon in different sectors. So what if we introduce carbon pricing in general? What if we introduce carbon pricing on cars? What if we introduce carbon pricing on heating? What if we introduce carbon pricing on air travel? And what we did find that most of these taxes are regressive. So they result in a higher relative increase in expenditure for lower income people. all of them except taxing flights. So if you tax flights, it's regressive. It's progressive. It's not regressive. So it's the only kind of carbon pricing which would be progressive. And that's because of what I've just shown, that there are huge inequalities, both in absolute terms and in income terms between groups. But we also discovered that there are other relevant inequalities. So we try to model the probability of people being a frequent flyer and we did find that in theory, if we have an ideal, typical, very international person who's an immigrant with family abroad and so on low incomes, this person is more likely to be a frequent flyer than even a very rich, very local person. So a very local British person, no family abroad, no migration background, a true Brit, would be less likely to fly frequently than a poor migrant with family. But so if we are to tax frequent flyers, this might raise some equality issues for these people. But we probably shouldn't blow this out of proportion, because if I try to estimate how many people in the sample will actually correspond to this ideal, typical poor migrant, and it's 0.002% of the population of the UK. So it's not a very big share of the population who would be adversely affected. I will skip on this one. And I have two concluding slides. So first one is what about emerging flight dependence, which is sort of this idea we've been thinking about this week. So on one hand, it is a very different thing than car dependence, because it's still extremely unequal and still most people don't participate in it or participate very little, right? And the emissions are mostly due to few and mostly privileged frequent flyers. So the issues around inequality are less pronounced. But there also some evidence of emerging lock-in, at least among certain sectors of the population, through early socialization, through migration and spatial dispersion of social networks, and through induced demand. So the reason why these things are important is that there might be already some future growth might be already baked in. So children today who are experiencing very flight intensive lives will be more keen to fly as adults in 10, 20 years. And they might be less keen on, for example, introducing taxes on air travel, because they just take it for granted that it exists and it's something they do, and they do for cheap. So this might be something that complicates climate policy going forward. It might also be a reason, that's the spin I try to put on this, it might be a reason for us to introduce such taxes and measures sooner rather than later. So polls tell us that if we ask the population, is it fine if we tax flights more? There is a majority support for it, which is very much unlike cars. So if we ask people, should we tax cars more? They say no. No way, don't do that. If say tax flights more, oh, well, why not? I don't do it. That's what there are majorities in most places. I think in Poland it might be different though. I think I've seen some polls that showing that it's different. But still, there is some level of support. But if these trends continue, this support might be less in 10 and 20 years. So if that's the case, then it would be politically sensible to do these things now rather than in 15 years. I wanted to conclude with something which is going slightly off a tangent now, but I was slightly worried that about the fit between my topic and your institute, or that you might think, okay, this is interesting, Giulio, but what does it have to do with, cities and urbanity and so on? So I just wanted to put my foot down and say, I do believe this is a very urban issue, although it's often not framed as that. So we know from research, for example, that Michael has done and so on, that levels of air travel are much higher in cities And this is partly because of some of the things I've shown, that in cities you have more migrants, have more people with social networks. You also have larger airports. So all of these things I've been telling you about, they tend to happen in cities and in large cities. And there's also a link which Micha has shown with cosmopolitan attitudes, which is also something that tends to happen in cities more than in rural suburban areas. And these are not incidental things. These are like key attributes of urbanity. Cities, they've always been places where there were diverse range of people with a diverse range of background coming from a range of different places. And there's always been better long distance travel infrastructure and so on. So there is some sort of association between urbanity at the more sociological understanding of it and air travel. And we can also think of that in terms of the role of global cities as nodes in a space of flows. So if these cities are nodes in a space of flows, then clearly we would expect these things related to flight dependence to happen more there than in other places which are not nodes. Also, there's a more deliberate side of it. So in Europe, city tourism is one of the main drivers of growth in tourism. A lot of people go and see cities more than beaches. And there have been estimates showing that in very touristic cities like Brussels and Barcelona, if you estimate the climate footprint of people just coming in and visiting the city, it is even larger than the emissions of the people living there for all purposes over a year. So like the main contribution of a city like Barcelona to climate change is not necessarily what the people who live there do, but the fact that it's such an attractive place that so many people come there to visit it. And this is not something that happens despite cities. Like cities actively have city marketing strategies that rely on tourism inflows to develop. So I think this really deserves to be framed to some extent as an urban issue, and it's been sort of overlooked aspect of the urban decarbonization agenda. I hope I was sort of within time with my presentation, because now I stop.